We had a great silver senator from the state of Nevada, Senator Patrick McCarran. He said, today the people of France are praying, clamoring for silver. I will tell you why. Those governments have issued paper money, paper money, paper money, until the masses of the people of the subjugated countries have lost faith in controlled currencies because they know the printing press runs on forever. And they have been through a period in their history when they could hold a bale of the paper in their hand and couldn't get a loaf of bread for it. But the fellow with a little piece of silver coin tucked away in his pocket could buy the necessities of life. And so the teeming millions of the world are asking for silver.
Hey friends, thanks for joining us. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the program for the first time Charles Savoie, and he's the author of the Silver Squelchers, which provides more than 3,000 pages of documentation of the nearly century-long scheme to devalue and demonetize silver, with roads leading back to the shadowy group called the Pilgrims Society, which claims Paul Volcker and Henry Kissinger as members. Charles, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Sean. I'm happy to be here.
Hey, it's great to have you here. I wanted to start by reading something to you, and it's really about the Pilgrims. I think you probably find it as serendipitous, maybe coincidental as I do, that this shadowy group is called the Pilgrims, when of course the Mayflower's maiden voyage held pilgrims, which came here supposedly to break free of King George and render unto the people such freedoms. One wonders what the true story is when I think you'd point out that the Pilgrims Society links directly back to the British royals.
That is exactly right.
Well, tell us about that. What is the Pilgrims Society, and how does it wield so much power when it comes to silver?
Well, Sean, this thing is, I was outside recently after dark, and I was looking up at the stars in the sky, and I felt like a little gnat looking up at all that, and that's kind of the way I feel when I look at this organization, because the more I delve into it, and I'm fortunate to be in receipt of 9 leaked membership rosters dating from the first one in 1914 and the last one 1980. This is the only globalist group in the entire world still, as of 2016, refusing to post membership rosters to the public domain. That's one of the things that sets it apart from the rest. There are many other things that set it apart from the rest. It happens to function as the money trust for the dynastic families of the old British Empire, which today it's called a Commonwealth. It's comprised of 21 million square miles, and one of those countries is India. When the British left India in 1947, they allegedly gave the Indian nation their independence. However, they fastened the Reserve Bank of India onto the country. And it's the same story with the United States. England doesn't have to conquer us financially once they had a central bank fastened onto the economy. And the Pilgrims Society, oh, God help, it's the genealogies in this organization are literally off the scale. It traces back to old European royalty, dating back over 1,000 years. It traces back to the British Empire colonization activities. They actually had a lot of struggle with the Dutch in the world colonial scene, but at some point in the 17th century, they reached a concordat with the Dutch, and they gave the Dutch the Spice Islands, what's called the Spice Islands, over in the Indonesian sphere. And those were immensely profitable. They were marking up spices 600 to 1. Anyway, the northeast of the USA was originally called New Amsterdam, which now we call it New York. It was renamed New York in 1664 when the British sent an invasion force over to retake it from the Dutch. And a member of that invasion force was a man named William Nottingham, like the Sheriff of Nottingham, England. And one of the charter members of the Pilgrims in New York in 1903 was named William Nottingham. Obviously not the same William Nottingham, but a direct descendant. And he was a charter member of the Pilgrims in 1903. This is all about the British controlling the world. And you can certainly find plenty of voices that are telling you, well, the Jesuits, the Vatican, the Pope, et al., control the world, and certainly there are struggles. And that could make for a whole other discussion. Honestly, I was raised a Catholic, and I know something about Catholicism. I just don't see that anybody but the British are on top of the heap. And it isn't just one family. It isn't just the Rothschilds. There's dozens of dynastic families in on this thing.
Yeah, I concur, and I think what's inspiring about what you've done here to reveal the Pilgrim Society, we hear a lot of talk about the Freemasons, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberger Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, but I think it's your work primarily, if not solely, that has shined a light on this group known as the Pilgrims Society. And again, getting back to that Mayflower voyage, it very much has the ring of colonialism, doesn't it, Charles? Because in 1620, these would-be settlers, these pilgrims, joined a London stock company that would finance their trip aboard the Mayflower. I'm reading this from History.com, a source that I do not trust since they're going to celebrate 9/11 and tell the official story over and over again here in just a few days. But the Mayflower, a three-masted merchant ship, set sail in 1620, and it seems to me, based on your work, one could easily make the leap that that was all part of British colonialism. They can tell us the stories they want about Christopher Columbus and the Mayflower, but your work really tells us a different story.
Well, see, in fact, the current president of the Pilgrims of the United States, based in New York, is a man named Miner, M-I-N-E-R, Hill Warner, and his father was named Bradford Arnold Warner, and he traces to William Bradford of the original Massachusetts Bay Colony. And also we have other people from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. John Winthrop, who was a multi-term governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Guess what? The Winthrop family are one of the families directly behind the Federal Reserve System. They're intermarried with the Rockefellers.
Shocking.
Winthrop W. Aldrich was ambassador to England in the 1950s. He became chairman of the silver-suppressing Chase National Bank. And these dynastic Boston, Massachusetts families are the dynasties behind the $29 trillion State Street Corporation in Boston, which is one of the big, heavy holders of the CME Group, which owns the Comex.
It's so interesting. This is going to sound a little pop culture-y, a little bit nonsense, but I'm going to mention it. What they've been doing, these families have been doing for generations, is intermarrying to keep the power centers.
That's right.
To keep
That's right.
Yeah, to keep them centered. And Nikki Hilton Rothschild, guys, you may want to Google that. Nikki Hilton, the sister of Paris Hilton, recently married a Rothschild. Meanwhile, we see the Rothschilds funding, essentially, Hillary's campaign, their chosen puppet for 2016, by holding $100,000 per head fundraisers. And guys, I mentioned colonialism. For those who aren't 100% familiar with what that means, I'll read you the definition here. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. We may have had some freedom in this country early on, but it didn't take long, Charles, for the Rothschilds to get their central bank anchored in this country. And once it took root in 1913, that was pretty much the end of it.
Well, Sean, the history of the Pilgrims Society, and for the sake of your listeners who are new to the subject, it has a branch in London and a branch in New York, and there's only those two branches. However, the reach of the organization is, well, to give you just one example, one of the members personally controls over 800 organizations, and that's Crown Prince Philip, who's the father of Prince Charles. Prince Philip is a big population control activist. Anyway, you were asking about the central banks. The history of the Pilgrims Society in this country is very heavy around the first United States Bank, which ran from 1791 to 1811. The key player domestically in the first USA Bank was a man named Stephen Girard, and Stephen Girard was the wealthiest person in the United States in his time. And then in 1811, when we didn't renew the charter of the bank, we got the War of 1812 handed to us as a result. And then the second USA Bank started in 1816 till Andrew Jackson finished strangling it in 1836. Then, when we didn't renew the bank's charter, England had to make a decision: either invade the USA again or invade China. So they chose to invade China because China was strenuously resisting the British opium business in China, which was sucking tens of thousands of tons of silver out of China. They didn't have the military wherewithal to invade both countries, so they chose China because they were going to make more money by invading China. But what they did was they gave us the Panic of 1837 in retaliation.
Yep. Manipulating behind the scenes, causing chaos. It's the age-old playbook of these globalists. And, you know, one of the things I wanted to ask you, Charles, and we can keep going back and forth here on the history because I find it so incredibly interesting, and what you bring to the table is something no one else does bring to the table. But I want to just ask you about the manipulation of the precious metals today in paper form. We know that Deutsche Bank is admitted to manipulating the markets in the LBMA. We can see what's going on at the COMEX. Meanwhile, we see physical going to the east with the foundation of the SGE and the physical exchange. John Williams, as recently as, I think, 2014, cited that silver, when accounting for M1, M2, M3 money printing, should be at $660 an ounce. Okay? So given that this manipulation appears to never end, I'm starting to believe that the only way we will see silver reflect a real-world price in dollars is when the dollar dies and hyperinflation begins. Your thoughts on this maniacal control over silver and gold via the paper markets?
Well, Sean, anybody can read the Silver Stealers. If people look at the Silver Stealers site, they'll read that these pilgrims have been involved in every major attack on silver for over 110 years. They always existed in one form or another. They existed as the St. George's Society starting in 1770. And oh, by the way, for the information of your listeners, most of the people in this country causing us problems at the highest levels, religiously, they are Episcopalians. Okay? Now, I've seen this pattern over and over and over and over and over and over and over. Episcopalian, Episcopalian, Episcopalian. That's not to say that there's not other groups. There are. But
well, let me just jump in to save myself from the comments section right away. We see a lot of Jewish people at the head of these central banks and these bloodlines. So we need to throw that out there. I don't know how it could just be the Episcopalian. The Episcopalians aren't running the central banks.
You've got to understand that. Okay, why don't we consider this? Who's on top of the heap in the world power structure? There's a big craze about, the Rothschilds are on top of the heap. Yeah, and you know what I think about that? They could be. And then others say, no, the Rockefellers are on top of the heap, and my take on that is they could be. But the more I've studied this organization, the more it seems to me that it's the Windsors, the British royal family, on top of the heap. Now, why don't we just all agree that since none of us are actually on the inside of this thing, we don't absolutely know, but we can have our opinions, and we can differ on the subject. For instance, in the 1914 list of the Pilgrims, London, there was a man named Sir Edgar Speyer, S-P-E-Y-E-R, and he was involved with Charles Yerkes out of Chicago in taking over, forming the underground electric railway system in London. And the Speyers are one of the Jewish dynasties that is a satellite dynasty around the Rothschilds. Another example would be the Schiffs. Another example out of the mining sector would be the Guggenheims. But Sir Edgar Speyer was removed in 1921 from the Privy Council to the Crown of England by King George V. And then I see he's not in the Pilgrims of Great Britain 1924 roster. So this is a royalist organization, and people say, well, the Rothschilds funded Cecil Rhodes in the diamond and gold business in South Africa. Absolutely they did, but so did the Duke of Abercorn and other members of the royal family. So this is an overlooked aspect that people don't want to get into, but I just mentioned a member of the Speyer family. Well, up to a few years ago, there was a guy, chairman of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, name it Jerry Speyer. So this organization, I'm giving you my opinion, okay? I'm giving you my opinion that the royal family is on top of the world heap. I'm saying that might not be right, but I'm saying from my look into this organization, and I've studied it more than any other living person, that's what it seems to me. Because, for another example, in the London list of the Pilgrims, there are more members over there directly associated with the royal family than with any other dynasty. And the Pilgrims were the organization that gave rise to so many other globalist groups. You look at the Japan Society in 1907, it was the forerunner of the Trilateral Commission over 60 years before that, 66 years before, founded by a member, the Pan American Society to impose central banks on the South American economies so that they couldn't use silver as money, founded by members, the Council on Foreign Relations 1921, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Bilderberg Conferences, the Trilateral Commission, many other organizations founded by members of this Pilgrims Society.
Right. Right. Well, let me jump in and say I agree with you, and I don't have the hubris it would require to say that any one group is the one group that's responsible. And I want to clarify what I was saying about Jews being involved in central banks. I've made clear time and time again that it's Rothschild Zionism and the Balfour Declaration and the funding of Israel. You can see the hand behind the curtain directing these events. It does involve the Rothschilds. It does involve the British Empire. You mentioned Prince Philip, an avowed Nazi. The British royals and Wall Street bankers funded Hitler and managed World War II and manipulated the history. And I agree with you. I mean, the Vatican's involved. The British royals are involved. I'll just give another example, too, as this multi-headed hydra plays out its strategy to ensnare and enslave humanity. Just take a look what's going on right now in the current election. You've got neocons, previously pledged to George Bush and the Bush family and Republicans, now turning and saying, we're going to back Hillary because Trump's the devil. I mean, it's a multi-headed hydra, and I think people are waking up to the fact that what we're told is the real history. What we're told by the mainstream media on a daily basis in this country, Charles, is nothing but kindergarten nonsense. They literally spoon-feed us made-up history and made-up facts and downright lies on a daily basis, and it's getting so obvious and blatant at this point that I think people from all walks of life are waking up.
Yeah, I think it was a member named of John Howland Gibbs Pell from Rhode Island. You've never heard the name, but he was head of Wall Street Investing Corporation for many years, and I think he was also president of the American Historical Association for a long time. Of course, there's a lot of Jewish people involved, but I've seen cases in record of Jews in this country becoming Episcopalians.
Mm-hmm.
In order to gain status in the Pilgrims Society. For instance, one of the families that's been behind central banking in this country, the Astor, A-S-T-O-R family, they were not Jews, although some people have said they were, but they're not. John Jacob Astor was known as the landlord of New York as of the 1840s, and he was the main domestic power behind the Second United States Bank. And right behind him was a member of the DuPont family, who became big users in the Silver Users Association. But I see the same names from centuries past in 20th century genealogies. I found a Franklin H. Satterthwaite in the 1980 Pilgrims list, descended from Benjamin Franklin, and also connected to the Bache, B-A-C-H-E family, which owned Placer Dome gold mines. They were also one of the groups that brought down the Hunts in 1980, Bache and Company. And this thing is grown together more than any clump of cypress roots in a swamp. And sometimes I just get sick thinking about these intergrown genealogies and all this stuff going on. And now, you know what I told you about the other presidential candidate, right?
Yeah, about Trump.
Okay, I told you about that. So And I'm going to
Well,
vote
let's
for
clarify. You didn't tell me anything. You just emailed me something about Trump having taken a loan for casinos
Well,
back in the
wait.
day that I think involved money from Rockefeller and
Well,
Rothschild.
yeah.
But I would just make the point that at
Yeah.
this point, and I said this to another friend in email recently, the Rothschilds own everybody's debt. These central banks own everybody's debt. Mine, the mortgage, the house you live in, the house I live in. Look at Japan. Look what the Central Bank of Japan is doing to the stock market. They own some 40% of, I think, the stock market at this point. These central banks own everyone's debt, Charles.
Actually, Sean, if you want to get into the Central Bank of the U.S., okay, the Federal Reserve, going through a list of the Pilgrims, like I've done, I'm still doing, I'm finding that members of these dynastic families have been on the board of directors of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank, and these dynastic families, and we could throw out some names. Mellon, I believe I mentioned the Winthrops, the Aldriches, the Astors, the Harrimans, and on and on. They are the primary shareholders in our top 5 mega banks, Bank of America, the Delafields. They traced the Count Delafeld in France almost 1,350 years ago, and they're still on the scene. They were among the founders of the Bank of America. But anyway, the big banks own the Federal Reserve shares, and the dynastic families own the controlling blocks of stock in J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and on. So it all gets back to this Pilgrim Society, and I'm telling you, I guarantee they're not all Jews, and the majority of them, at least by head count, are Episcopalians. And that's the same as the Church of England, okay?
Right. Well,
That's the same thing.
Well, let me circle back, though, and ask you something. You described this, I think, as an intertwined cypress root. I mean, it's just so huge and monolithic and intertwined at this point. There's no way of unwinding it. The question is, can we defeat it? I feel less and less hopeful that we can after having a conversation like this one. But if we look at the U.S. dollar, the petrodollar, if we look at what's going on in China, as there seems to be a move now, a quick move to the SDR. This is a headline that appeared on Tuesday. Are emerging markets about to switch U.S. Treasuries for SDR bonds? I read something recently in an interview, too, in which China appears to have been offered the same opportunity to get rid of U.S. Treasuries for U.S. bonds. The Fed is now saying another $4 trillion will be needed to stem the next economic shock. So getting back to that previous question I had, will the meltdown of the dollar be the only thing that will allow silver to go higher? Because at this point, it appears that the manipulation knows no end.
Well, Sean, a thought that I've had in recent months since silver broke out of the gutter of being 13, 14, 15 for so long, it actually hit $21 after hours one day a couple of weeks ago. And then I noticed the next day it had been deleted at some site that it actually ranged up to 21, and they said, no, it just hit 2037. Well, anyway, I'm thinking that the powers that be let silver rise some so that the primary silver mines could start pumping out more silver so they could keep the scam going longer. It's just like the Silver Purchase Act in 1934. England had driven silver down to 24.5 cents an ounce in February 1931. That caused the Great Depression by destroying the purchasing power of the Far East, whose money was silver. We had big export industries to the Far East at the time, and when their money failed, they couldn't buy our exports, and it caused mass unemployment over here. And everybody says, oh no, the stock market crash in 1929 caused a depression. The hell it did. All that was about was getting their payrolls back, but people still had their jobs. See, unemployment is defined as absence of a job. The depression is absence of a job. So you're asking me when silver's going to rise. Well, I'll tell you what Butler has often said. He's not a prophet, you know. I'm not a prophet either, but I think one of the keys that you got to watch is the dealer deliverable silver on the COMEX, that inventory. But you know what? Even that's not guaranteed, because Harvey Organ was looking at the deliverable silver on the Shanghai Silver Exchange. What was it, in December of 2014? And he says, well, you know, silver's going to hit 200 an ounce before the year's out. But it didn't, because they had an unknown stockpile from somewhere to bring in more silver, see?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like something from Star Trek and Aliens, where they said they just keep coming at you and at you, year after year, tricking and punishing. So I want to tell people something important, and it doesn't even, without even mentioning the Pilgrims Society, that is, if you want to help the country on a better track, forget about the presidential race. You can decide to vote for who you want to, and for my money, Trump is the lesser of all evils. But if you want to help the country, for God's sakes, become active at state legislative level. Look at Colorado. Look at Washington State. They got marijuana legalized. And now I don't use any of that stuff. I use coffee, tea, chocolate, and honey as a sweetener. Those are my only drugs, if they could be called drugs. I don't use it, but I don't think it should be criminalized either, because the prison industry wants to profit. Oh, the Pilgrim Society started the prison industry. That would be a whole other situation to talk about. But I can't tell you when silver's going to rise. I don't think it's going to happen until after the election. And my big concern is, say, we've got China maneuvering in the Pacific, and we've got Turkey and Russia maneuvering in Syria, etc. And so we've got hot spots around the world. We've got our warmongers over here. And I'm thinking England is going to use us for a third world war like they did for the previous two. They dragged us into both world wars to fight for the British Empire. And so I'm worried that they're going to say, hey, war's broken out. We don't have a silver stockpile. Turn it in. We can't have hoarders and speculators holding the country hostage in time of war, and we can't have them profiting from the country's misfortune. Never mind that these Pilgrim Society families that own Raytheon and all these other defense industries are going to profit enormously again. So all I can tell you is I don't recommend that anybody roll over and just turn in their silver or their gold. Now, a lot of people are raving about Texas. Oh, Texas has a Texas Gold Bank, and the language of the bill says that the feds can't come and take your gold or silver. But you know what? You got to go back and reread Bill 483. It says, other than by an authority of this state in two places, Texas gets a D- in civil asset forfeiture by the Institute for Judicial Reform or Institute for Justice. So, Sean, I've moved all my silver recently to an unknown location in New Mexico.
Okay, well, now that's interesting. I was going to bring up the Texas Gold Depository because you mentioned get involved in your state legislature, and I agree with you. People need to take this thing back on a local level. That's really the place where we have the most power. But I do find the Texas Gold Depository inspiring. I think Kyle Bass might have been the guy behind that idea. I mean, and it's because people, well-heeled people, smart people like Kyle Bass are waking up to the fact that all of these paper claims on gold or silver mean you have nothing if you don't hold the physical, Charles. And at the end of the day, the best message, the best example of how important it is to hold physical precious metals is being shown to us by what's going on in Venezuela. I mentioned in a recent interview a couple grams of gold to buy 6 months of food, and then I did the research to figure out how that was in my head, and it comes from SRS Rocco. It's 1 ounce of silver will buy around 5 months of food right now in Venezuela, as the rest of the population starves. So getting back to my thesis that it will be the death of the dollar that will cause silver and gold to go far higher, and that is the exact situation in which you're going to want to have the physical and may not be willing to trade it for fiat dollars at all.
Yeah, you just mentioned what's going on in Venezuela. We had a great silver senator from the state of Nevada, Senator Patrick McCarran, and he was widely quoted in a number of issues of the Mining Congress Journal in years past before it got taken over. And one of the things he said about chaos that they had in Europe and France was, this is verbatim quote from him now. He said, today the people of France are praying, clamoring for silver. I will tell you why. Those governments have issued paper money, paper money, paper money, until the masses of the people of the subjugated countries have lost faith in controlled currencies because they know the printing press runs on forever, and they have been through a period in their history when they could hold a bale of the paper in their hand and couldn't get a loaf of bread for it. But the fellow with a little piece of silver coin tucked away in his pocket could buy the necessities of life. And so the teeming millions of the world are asking for silver.
I love your passion. It's given me goosebumps. You said something very important. You used the phrase subjugated countries. That's what this nation is, just like Venezuela, just like all of the other nations in the world with central banks, are subjugated countries. We need to throw off this subjugation. We need to throw off these tyrants. We need to get rid of the central bank. And I think if there's any good news, Charles, it's that Janet Yellen and the Federal Reserve puppets being controlled by the House of Rothschild and the Morgans and the Rockefellers and all of those families you name that are shareholders in the Federal Reserve, they're being exposed for what they're doing to this nation. You know, they're being exposed for the tyrants they are, and it's their job to kill our currency.
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
That's why we have these conversations, because I don't know how to stop them. Ron Paul tried. He couldn't stop them. I'm not sure how to stop them, but one thing we can do is wake up those who are listening so that they can take action to protect what they have left.
Well, Sean, the Pilgrims Society, which London is the primary branch, the American members are probably the junior partners, is what it looks like to me. And one of those families in the U.S., the Mellons, as of 1933, there was a Texas congressman named Wright Patman. He said their fortune was equal to the entire value of all the property in the state of Texas. Yeah. But they're probably the junior partners. See, now if you look at the London branch and all these families that go back for centuries to William the Conqueror in 1066, he came over from France and took over England. Well, and let's talk about the Jewish members now, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, the Guggenheims, and the Schiffs, the Loebs, etc. In medieval times, it was both the Catholics and the Protestant princes of Europe. They both forbade the Jews to own land. So that's why the Jews became big in the diamond business. They also became big in the rare coin and gold coin business, which the Rothschilds started out as coin dealers to German nobility. Now, I have a recent quote from London about Gerald Cavendish Grosvenor that he basically owns London. Okay, he's the Duke of Westminster. He's not a Jew. He's a member of the Anglican Church of England. His wife descends from Russian nobility who are also not Jewish. Their fortune in modern terms was reckoned at $300 billion. The Duke of Westminster owns half of the Wells Fargo Tower in Los Angeles right now through Grosvenor Holdings. And Wells Fargo is one of the banks back of the Federal Reserve. The Wells Fargo interests were among the founders of the Pilgrims in New York in 1903. The Duke of Westminster owns major skyscrapers and real estate developments in 70 cities around the world. And we might also mention another group that we haven't heard much about, the Order of the Garter. It traces back to the King of England in 1344, who founded this organization. Gerald Grosvenor, Pilgrims London, he's a member of the Order of the Garter. The Order of the Garter is limited to 26 people at any one time. But the Order of the Garter, having just 26 people, really you can't run the world with just 26 people. And most of them are also in the Pilgrims. And I'm trying to put pressure on this Pilgrims Society to start posting rosters to the public domain, and if more websites would allow coverage, we could put pressure on them to post rosters. And if we did, I guarantee you're going to find names like Bill Gates, Order of the British Empire. Yeah. You're going to find George Soros, you're going to find Warren Buffett, et cetera, that they're members, and we know they're members of Bilderberg, but we can't get this other group. This is the last place they have to hide.
I think what you're saying is extremely important, and it gets us back to this idea that the British royal family still wields enormous power along with these other groups, the Rothschilds. I mean, I think as we said earlier in the interview, a multi-headed hydra. And correct me if I'm wrong, isn't the Queen of England the largest landowner on planet Earth?
You know what? A lot of people tell you that's a technicality, and some people say, yeah, the Queen is worth something like $33 trillion. For example, the British Commonwealth right now composed of, 21% of the land surface of the world, which includes Canada and Australia. But I can't tell you about things like that. I do know that that old witch owns thousands of diamonds, and one of them is worth $400 million. That's the Great Star of Africa that came out of one of Cecil Rhodes' mines around 1906. And but this thing about British influence is so drastically underrated. NATO is a British creation.
Mm-hmm.
So England cannot beat an adversary like Russia or China by itself. Obviously, they can make some dent in it, but they've got to get financial control over the United States and other countries, like you said, central banks all over the world, in order to control us monetarily, militarily. Hey, there have been so many generals and admirals and ambassadors as vice presidents of the Pilgrims Society. They had the generals from both sides of the American Civil War come in 1903 to help found the group so that they could advise the financiers on how to conduct World War I.
Right. Well, one thing I want to say, you mentioned Gates and Buffett, and I had written that down prior to my last comment, and I forgot to mention it. We always see that Forbes 100 Richest People list with Gates and Buffett, maybe Carlos Slim at the top, and it's an absolute joke. I mean, that's the cover story. That's the public-facing wealth.
That's right.
Behind-the-scenes private wealth that controls the globe are the people you just mentioned. And it needs to be said because most people have no idea. And again, most people live as kindergartners on this planet with kindergarten-level knowledge of human history.
That's right. And a current, or he was current as of the last time I knew, we have found, or I have found, say I'm working with Joel van der Riesen over in the Netherlands, and we've collaborated with each other in exchanging rosters of the Pilgrims. He's been extremely helpful to me. But anyway, a recent executive committee member on the Pilgrims, New York, John R. Drexel IV. Now, the original J.P. Morgan, way back in the 1800s, guess who his mentor was? A member of the Drexel family. Yeah, so this John R. Drexel IV, a multi-generational member of the Pilgrims organization, his wife is a member of the Astor family from the landlord of New York, John Jacob Astor. The New York Social Diary several years ago said that the Astor real estate holdings in Manhattan today are north of $100 billion. It cannot get on the Forbes or the Fortune 400 list because, like you say, they want to give the impression that the new kids on the block, like Zuckerberg, they could bring him down so easy. They control the American legal system. They've had people on the Supreme Court. They always have the President of the United States as an honorary member. And I've got a number of ways of proving that in court that they do. And who appoints the federal judges? Oh, the President appoints. I don't know how much time we've got left, but let me get in one little thing here.
Yeah, and I have a question for you too before we let you go. I guess I would just say one thing though, as I've made the point about Gates and Buffett, and you just mentioned Facebook's
Zuckerberg.
Yeah, you mentioned Zuckerberg. This is single generational wealth. The real money powers of this planet are multi-generational intermarried banking wealth. Monarchies. This is the playbook, and it's been going on for generations, and that's how they keep the money in the families. But you were going to say something.
Well, the Pilgrims is interlocked with a lot of organizations that people that go to your site, unless they've read the Silver Squelchers, they wouldn't even notice, like the Order of the Merovingian dynasty that ruled France for 300 years, the Order of the Crown of Charlemagne, which succeeded the Merovingian dynasty. Charlemagne is known as the father of Western civilization, and these people are in this thing today. And this thing goes back in Americans of royal descent, members of blood royal, etc., the hereditary society community that people don't hear much about. I mean, but these people are pulling the strings big time. But in my opinion, I've been forced to the conclusion. I started out thinking that the bankers were running the show. But the more I look at it, the more I'm thinking the royals are running the show. In any case, it doesn't necessarily make any difference, because in the end, the bankers, the royals, they all have the same intentions toward us. They want us broke and dead. And they want to cut world population down to probably under 500 million. But let me give your listeners just one example out of the Pilgrims. This will take about a minute. Thomas W. Lamont, 1870 to 1948, was chairman of J.P. Morgan and Company, and he was chairman of the Pilgrims Executive Committee as of the leaked 1940 roster, which, by the way, we found that after a lot of digging in the Astor and Tilden sections of the New York Public Library genealogical section. That took a long time to find. Okay, but anyway, Lamont was a Harvard graduate, meaning he was not a Yale graduate, which in turn means he was not a member of Skull and Bones Society. Now, Skull and Bones is a feeder organization into the Pilgrims, like the other Yale fraternities, the Wolf's Head Society, the Berzelius, the Book and Snake, the Scroll and Key, the Raven Society at the University of Virginia, the Sphinx Head Society at Cornell, and on and on. But Ferdinand Lundberg, a monetary historian who never mentioned the Pilgrim Society, in America's 60 Families, 1937, page 33, here's what he said of Thomas Lamont. Quote, an extraordinarily complex and resourceful personality like Thomas Lamont, who has been the brains of J.P. Morgan and Company throughout the post-war period, that's World War I, after World War I, and was a mentor of Woodrow Wilson in the Wilson's second administration, as well as of President Herbert Hoover throughout his fateful single term in the White House, and has exercised more power for 20 years in the Western Hemisphere, and has put into effect more final decisions from which there has been no appeal than any other person. Lamont has been the first consul de facto in the invisible directory of post-war high finance and politics, a man consulted by presidents, prime ministers, governors of central banks, then directing intelligence behind the Dawes and the Young plans. Lamont is a diplomat, a writer, an editor, publisher, a politician, a statesman, an international presence, as well as a financier. Now let's bring that down to right now. Lamont's great-grandson, Ned Lamont, a Connecticut politician, he is a Pilgrims Society member who's made his own fortune besides whatever he inherited, which must have been pretty big. He made a fortune in cable communications. His wife is a director of Hospital Corporation of America, big-time vaccine pushers. Hospital Corporation of America is infamous for paying the biggest fraud settlement in U.S. history and price gouged a Florida man in 2015 for $45,000 for an emergency room visit after he said he didn't even need to go.
Well, guys, this is the kind of information you can only get from Charles Savoie, and you can get it at silversteelers.net. Charles, I wanted to ask you one more thing before we go. Let's just circle it back to the importance of silver. Many of us call it the Achilles heel of the bankers. I was listening to the interview you did with our friend Kenneth Amaduri over at Vision Victory YouTube channel, and you mentioned the DoD's strategic silver stockpile, which in 1970 was 165 million ounces of physical silver. Why was it so important to this nation then, but apparently it isn't now?
Well, Sean, you have to understand that over the years, if you go back some generations of time in the 20th century, we had what was contemptuously referred to by the media as the Western Silver Bloc of senators from Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, etc. And the only reason that they were able to hold their own against the banking industry for a while was because the so-called farm bloc of the agricultural Midwest was allied with them, and they could control enough votes to have a big impact on silver legislation. But as agribusiness industries, cartels took over the small farms more and more, we lost the farm bloc, and when we lost the farm bloc, the silver bloc, so-called, couldn't function anymore. So they demonetized silver gradually. The last silver coins are dated 1964. But Sean, actually, they were minting silver quarters dated 1964, into early spring of 1965. The reason I know is I've read Mint reports, I've read engineering and mining journal publishers on the subject, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason they dated them 1965 is because, they continued dating them 64 and 65 is the vending machine industry was in a panic that collectors would take out even more silver because we're going to make a transition to cheap slug coins. And so then the last remaining influence the silver bloc had was to get silver Kennedys, 40% silver Kennedys, from 65 to 69, I think it was, or 65 to 70. Anyway, and after that, pardon me for using that word, but I'm upset about these guys. We have people like Harry Reid from Nevada. The only use he'd have for silver is to put it in the bottom of his toilet. He hates silver. And they're all bought off. They're bought off by the casino owners in Las Vegas are probably Pilgrims Society represented. I know Doug Ducey, governor of Arizona, he's got a lot of Pilgrims Society connections, like William Polk Carey and Company, big real estate operators, commercial real estate operators, very large group. And he vetoed silver legislation in Arizona. And he has a lot of other connections, too.
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is 165 million ounces of physical silver in the strategic stockpile
right.
in 1970 and 0 ounces today. One could also argue that there may be 0 ounces of gold, being that a Fort Knox audit hasn't happened since 1953-54.
That's right. And you know what? They've admitted that there's no when was it? Was it 2000 or thereabouts, 2001? The last 8 million ounces in the former strategic stockpile went for coinage of silver eagles. And I think the reason they allowed that was to say, we'll let it go to monetary uses. No, just a little percentage of it they did. And they had defense secretaries like Caspar Weinberger. If you go to the Pilgrims website, you'll find his name there. He was a defense secretary. He personally drained 24,435,000 ounces of silver out of that stockpile for price suppression. And Sean, these guys are multi-generational planners. They know, like David Rockefeller, he's sitting in his wheelchair up there in New York somewhere. He's had his 6th heart transplant, which he definitely doesn't deserve. But he's thinking, 200 years in the future, if we still don't have total control, here's what we're going to be doing then, blah, blah, blah. So we're only talking from 1970 to today, 46 years of that stockpile, and they had planned to exhaust the stockpile for price suppression. So who becomes the stockpile? People have saved in silver. See, they want to create a crisis. The Pilgrims Society create a crisis. They run the big banks. If you look at any of these lists from like 1957, 1940, 14, 24, 33, 1980, 74, 69, etc., they were all over the big banks. They're all over the board, the key board of directors, the chairman of the banks, the key members of banking management, their overseas offices, the London banks, Barclays, the former National Westminster, Royal Bank of Scotland. They're all over that. The Australian and Canadian banks. There's always members on the board of directors of those things.
Yeah, and it's a multi-headed hydra, as we've said now 3 times in this interview. That's exactly what it is. Guys, you can find this information at silverstealers.net. That is a site that is dedicated to the work of Charles Savoie. And Charles, I just want to thank you for all your tireless work over the years. You probably don't get enough thanks, but I want you to know that really great people out there like David Morgan, Jeff Nielsen, Chris Duane, myself, we've all been influenced by your work. I found out about you, frankly, from Brother John F. and his great YouTube channel, who read a lot of your work in some of his earlier videos. And it's just really my pleasure to be able to speak with you here today. And just the final word, tell people about your excellent Silver Squelchers series and how they can find that.
The Silver Squelchers series, I just started out by Googling it. I haven't updated my I keep some of my works at nosilvernationalization.org. It needs some updating, but you can find, if you'll Google Silver Squelchers, and it ran number 1 through 34, and I'm not sure, Sean, that you have number 33 and 34 yet.
All right, I think I got 1 through 32, and I think, but doesn't Morgan have it at Silver Investor?
It should be. And number 34 is almost entirely about a guy I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Duke of Westminster. Mm-hmm. And he has a guy that he acquired through a relation by marriage, who is a director of the Sabin Vaccine Foundation, another member who's chairman of the Trinity Group in London. But anyway, people can go to look up Silver Squelchers and they'll find it, or they can also look up the silverstealers.net. And you've got to understand that Bilderberg didn't even exist until 1954.
Right.
Who was running the world before then? Well, the answer was brought out in congressional testimony in 1940 that was introduced by a silver congressman named Thorkelson from Montana, August 19, 1940, and he was referring to a speech by Joseph Choate, Choate, who was a lawyer for the Vanderbilt Railroad dynasty. Now, Wikipedia says the Vanderbilts are the seventh wealthiest dynasty in world history. They were among the founders of the Pilgrims. And anyway, he said that those who would celebrate the start of the Pilgrims' second century in 2003, quote, will have cause to bless their fathers, that they founded this society and kept the world on the right track. American Opinion magazine, Gary Allen, called the Pilgrims the world's most secret organization. That's where I got my first Pilgrims list, dated 1969. It was from a 76 press out in Santa Barbara, California, and Gary Allen had written some things about the Pilgrims, and I got my first list from them.
Hey, let me ask you something. I know we're trying to wrap this up, and of course, you being such a plethora of information, we could go on for a couple hours here, but did you just say the Vanderbilts were one of the most powerful, one of the most wealthy families?
Yeah, one of the seven. In fact, it's in the Silver Squelchers that at one time, two of the Vanderbilts were on the board of directors of over 300 railroad corporations, and in fact, the Pilgrim Society was all over the USA railroad industry like crazy.
Yeah, here's what's important about that, because it triggers what I talk about so often, which is, again, the multi-headed hydra. We talk about the Mockingbird mainstream media. Anderson Cooper has bloodlines to the Astors, and his mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, and he just did this loving documentary about his mother, Gloria Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
And then what do we see over at MSNBC? We see Angela Mitchell, a Mockingbird mainstream quote-unquote reporter who's married to former head of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. It is literally a multi-headed hydra. And guys, I really can't thank you enough for sticking with us through this interview with Charles Savoie. And Charles, we would very much love to have you back in the future.
Well, okay. I'm happy to help anytime I can, and I wanted to get some publicity for these worthy gentlemen. They did mention me at their site, www.pilgrimsociety.org. There's a PDF there dated 2012. I think it's the Harry Brittain lecture, and they were disparaging my work. And yeah, they mentioned me by name there.
Well, you know what? A lot of us in the alt media have been disparaged by trolls, and a lot of my work has proven that these trolls are paid trolls, or in many cases link back directly to fascist corporations. Guys, if you want to flush that out a little bit, just Google the video called "Which Criminal Bank Hates SGT Report," and you'll find out exactly who we were once being harassed by. Charles, again, thank you so much for your time.
I'm happy to help.
All right. And guys, thank you so much for visiting us at sgtreport.com for real news 24/7, the antidote to corporate propaganda. God bless.